Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Homeland Security Today's webinar series on leadership. We're very excited to have a very distinguished group of panelists with us this afternoon, speaking about one of the toughest topics facing the nation, and that is police reform. I don't think I have to preface this webinar very much, but to say that the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota was a devastating event for anyone who watched the video, and certainly for all Americans who were not quite aware of some of the challenges faced by the African American community, other minority groups, or those who are not secure that the police are out to protect them. Homeland Security Today took this topic on because of the incredible network of experts that we have access to, and of course also because to achieve Homeland Security, you need all of your citizens to feel secure. So we consider it a critical piece of our Homeland Security. We have been covering the movements of the white supremacists, other hate groups in the United States, and certainly stand with the FBI and other definitions that they are certainly terrorists. So with that, we would like to tackle today some of the perspectives on police reform. We're hearing a lot of inflammatory words, defund the police, a lot of phrases that work people up pretty quickly. I'm one of them. I will say, I was, Black Lives Matter, BLM, and then when I heard defund the police, I did take the time to read about it, learn what that really means. But if you don't do that, it can sound very daunting and certainly put people on alert. So we're hoping that today we contribute a rational conversation about the role of policing, how police can protect our citizens while at the same time getting rid of those who are not upholding the integrity of that position in our community. So we have an amazing group of experts today. And one, I do have to call out the Associate Dean of the Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, Michael McDaniel, because we got to give him an award in 2018 for achieving mission, not only for his work at the law school, but certainly as his amazing career. And so we were honored to meet him and be able to honor his work. And it's always great to see an alumni of that award ceremony back with us, still doing great things, still out there, and who knows, maybe another award recipient when we do it virtually this year. So if you all don't know me, I'm Christina Tanaschuk, and I am the executive editor of HSToday and also the CEO of the Government Technology and Services Coalition. Very glad to moderate today. We did have questions submitted in advance, so I will be asking those of the panelists. But as always, you have down at the bottom across your screen, you have a Q&A button. You can ask questions as we go along. Panelists will either answer them out loud, they may type an answer, or they will answer them at the end of the presentations. So without any more ado, I would like to introduce Tracy Brown, who's an Associate Dean at the law school, to start us off. Tracy, welcome.
Thank you very much. And I'll just introduce myself briefly and pass it along to my wonderful colleagues. Again, my name is Tracy Brain. I have been with WMU Cooley for the last 15 years. Before my time there, I was a public defender for 10 years, and then I worked for legal aid. And so in that time, I've represented a lot of indigent defendants in criminal cases and just done quite a bit of work with police and, with clients who had interactions with, who've had interactions with police. At the law school, I run a clinic helping area citizens pursue expungement of their criminal convictions. And I also do some tangential work with the Innocence Project here at the school. So I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me, Christina.
Excellent. Next, let's invite Tanya Kraus-Phelan, a professor at the law school, to introduce herself and any introductory comments.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. As she said, my name is Tanya Kraus-Phelan, and prior to joining the law school faculty in 2005, I was a criminal defense attorney in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I did that about 18 years before becoming a professor. And I did indigent defense, retained defense, trying everything from shoplifting to murder. And as Dean Brain mentioned, because of what I did as a criminal defense attorney, I certainly had a lot of interaction with police officers, as did my clients. But before I became a lawyer, I was actually a criminal justice major at Ferris State University in Michigan. And after becoming a lawyer, was asked to serve on an advisory board for the Ferris State University Criminal Justice Program, taught classes for criminal justice students, and have actually been involved in some minor training for police officers throughout the years. And so I'm happy to be here and to discuss this very important topic.
Thank you. Well, and next we have Lou Langham, who is a professor at the law school, and we welcome you, sir.
Well, I'm glad to be here as well. My name is Lou Langham. I teach criminal procedure and evidence and trial litigation practice skills at the law school. Prior to coming on board, I spent 25 years in the Michigan Department of State Police, mainly in the Criminal Investigation Division for 22 of those 25 years. I retired as a detective lieutenant from that agency. Attended law school. I became a criminal defense attorney upon graduation. I had my own criminal defense practice. I worked for several different organizations as well. I guess that means I can't hold down a job. So anyway, so I'm happy to be on board here. I enjoy what I do as a professor at WMU Cooley Law School, and I enjoyed my 25 years in state police, and I hope I could be of some assistance today along with my colleagues.
Excellent. And to our award winner, Associate Dean.
Thank you, Christina. Very brief bio. Before I became a professor of con law and homeland security law at WMU Cooley, I was at the Pentagon. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense Planning, Mission Assurance, and Force Protection. Before that, I was the State Homeland Security Advisor, and I'm a retired Brigadier General from the Michigan National Guard. So my interests have focused recently on the use of the military to counter protests, but I've also focused, and hope we can talk about today, the federalizing of law enforcement functions that we've seen in some of these protests, as well as the militarizing of law enforcement. And I hope that we can talk about those topics along with the other ones involved in police reform, because I think they're pretty important. Just as a suggestion on the militarization of law enforcement, there's sort of this focus on the law enforcement agencies themselves, but I was involved with this program, the 1033 program run by the Defense Logistics Agency, both as the State Homeland Security Advisor, and then when I was at the Pentagon. And one of the largest issues, I think, to be considered is the pressure that was put on local law enforcement. It specifically says that if you're going to have these weapons, for example, and again, this program, the 1033 program, applies to everything from office chairs to uniforms. It doesn't focus just on weapons and armored vehicles, though the media and public interest has, I think. But it specifically says you've got to use these weapons and you got to use this equipment within 1 year. You sign a memorandum of understanding or of agreement with the DLA saying that use these within a year. And I think it's sort of the law of secondary effects. It wasn't contemplated that they would then be used for purposes that were unrelated to counterterrorism and counter narcotics, though they have been. And I want to thank you, Christina, for the shout out about Homeland Security Today Mission Award. I've certainly been an avid reader and supporter ever since I was the State Homeland Security Advisor back at the very beginning. The other accomplishment I would like to tout on my own behalf is that I successfully represented Lou Langham, our other panelist, one time when he was a state police undercover officer and was able to obtain a finding of no liability for Lou in that case. Thank you.
Thanks for remembering that.
It seems like he's not going to let you forget. Well, thank you all for doing a bit of an introduction. I think since purchasing Homeland Security Today, what we've really tried to do is focus on experts who really have practical experience in the field. And knowing that you, Lou, and certainly Mike, that you all have practiced and really frankly know what you're talking about. That's part of the reason that HS Today, I think, has kind of been revitalized and re-engaged with the community at hopefully a very deep level. So I'd like to just kind of start it off by saying, you know, I'm wearing blue today because I back the blue, and I back Black Lives Matter. So I'm both at the same time. And I think that the polarized conversation that's happening because of politics, because of rhetoric, it really gets in the way of us getting together as people and starting to solve some of these challenges. George Floyd's death was not the first one. Yet that this keeps happening and we keep getting outraged and it's a cycle, and what do we actually do to make sure this cycle stops? So that's the purpose of part of this conversation today. So what I'd like to open it up and just have each of you comment, or whoever feels like commenting the most, about what you believe where we should begin to make sure that this does not happen again, or that at least we have made concrete steps toward assuring that this type of abuse of authority does not happen again.
Well, Christina, I think, and I'll start broadly because I know that my colleagues can speak more specifically regarding suggestions forward. But, one of the encouraging things to me after George Floyd's death was that there seemed to be just this real sense that people felt it, right? And not just in my community, not just in inner city communities, not just in Minneapolis, not even just in our country, but around the world, right? So for about the 3 weeks after Memorial Day, I was kind of on a media, cycle, talking to various outlets about what happened, about, within my expertise as an attorney, but also within my experience as a Black woman raising Black children. And I was blown away by just the interest, right? So I was on TV in Australia. I was interviewed by a Chinese newspaper. I was in the newspaper in Spain. People really seemed to reach out and want to talk about this. And what made me bring that up is to not, talk about my media cycle so much, but to get to what you said at the very beginning, that it seems to be difficult for us to have conversations, right? And to find ourselves sympathizing, right, with both sides or all sides at the same time. And to put it in, not trying to understate the massive kind of path ahead of us, but I really do think that we have to start there, right? And particularly in recent years, we've just had such a hard time having conversations. And unless we can talk honestly with one another about what happened, about some of the underlying dynamics about what happened, about the history of race in this country, right? And how it's played out in these kind of interactions, unless we can actually have an honest conversation about that, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. A lot of times people associate it with the, who think they're on the BLM team or the Black Lives Matter team, and they sympathize with George Floyd, and rightfully so. They don't want to hear anything that the police have to say, right? Because the police are the so-called enemy. And often, law enforcement, they feel attacked. And again, not always, that's not always a unreasonable feeling. And so it's hard for them, right? It wasn't me that did this. Why am I, why am I being blamed for something that happened for one bad cop or what have you? And I think that we all need to kind of get past that in order to, to really sit down and have conversations about the way forward. And then once we do that, we can talk reasonably about some of the wonderful suggestions I'm sure my colleagues will share.
Would anyone else like to comment on that, or shall I move forward with another question?
I guess I'd like to comment and follow up with what Tracy said in terms of framing our debate here today. I've been sort of ambivalent about this debate occurring, not about the debate, but about the debate occurring during an election year. On the one hand, it assures us that it's going to stay forefront and will get the attention it needs. But on the other hand, the con to the argument is that once you politicize, in this day and age, politicizing an argument is the same as demonizing the other side, and we've gotten too extreme. So I'd urge everyone to consider what Tracy said, that this is in fact a debate that has to be by well-meaning people on both sides coming to a common solution and looking for unity. And it shouldn't be a form of creating a greater schism than we already have. And with that,
No, that's excellent. We're actually having another webinar related to this next week, and one of the folks who's speaking trains law enforcement in the South, and he's a former Marine. And he brought up the fact, because I kept saying, well, how can this man have still been on the force? With all of the complaints against him, how is he still on the force? And he said, well, you have to take a look at the union and see what role the union had in keeping him on the force. And so I think in order to have an honest conversation about this, we're going to have to be able to talk about some of the sacred cows and see what's going to have to happen to make sure that if someone has repeated violations, that they can get them off the force, because that's ultimately what has to happen. If they are not, don't have the temperament to be a law enforcement officer, they should not be one. And so we need to look at all of those barriers. So what are some of the barriers that you all have identified in your work to really solving some of these challenges, or at least moving forward?
My thoughts on that have a lot to do in the initial phase as far as the recruiting process. It's very difficult to change a person from the inside. I mean, that's a big challenge. We have to try to do it. We want to do it, and efforts are going to be moving in that direction. But in the recruiting process, you can't, when you do background investigations, I mean, we know you do computer background investigations, you talk to references and those things. I think it needs to make sure that it goes beyond that a little bit further. Speak to individuals that maybe they don't want you to speak with. Talk to other people. We need to understand what kind of individuals that are being hired at the initial stage. If we can at least eliminate certain individuals from being allowed to move forward and be hired by a police agency, allowed to carry weapons and assist and arrest individuals, it would be a good thing to know that from the very beginning in the hiring process that those things have been looked into. I think we can eliminate a lot of the problems if we deal with it that way on the front end. We're still going to have issues, and they're going to be addressed along the way. But in that initial recruiting phase, I think we can probably eliminate a lot of the problems, not all of them, but a lot of the problems at that initial stage.
Any other thoughts on that?
I have two, and they're somewhat diverse from each other. The first is going to what Lou said. One of the problems with recruiting, and Lou is being a little too modest. You know, the Michigan State Police has less African-American members on its force than is the percentage of the population, civilian population in the state of Michigan, despite a number of efforts. And one of the problems, frankly, is salaries. Salaries of law enforcement is like salaries of public school teachers. They have not kept up with inflation at all. And never to attract the right people as a result of that. So you've got to be able to make it more attractive to folks. It's still attractive in both fields because of having a pension at the end. But in terms of getting by day to day, you talk to law enforcement, it's like talking to teachers. They all have a second job someplace so that they can continue with their first job, which is their love and desire, which is to assist society in the ways that they do. The second one, I think, is we do have to reconsider the 1033 program, the militarization, as it's often called, of law enforcement. There's a number of studies on that specifically, and these are very recent, and we don't have enough data. So don't take this as law or rule yet, but there are some trends there that have been identified by the studies between 2016 and the present time. because remember, the program really started post 2001. It started, the 1033 program started in 1997, but it really gained impetus after 9/11, of course, when there became a focus on counterterrorism, even at local law enforcement, and small to mid-sized law enforcement agencies are just unable to afford the equipment that they need for that sort of mission. But the results that we're seeing now are that it is sort of, first of all, there's no question it changes the physical appearance of law enforcement. And I'm going to defer back to Lou on this one, but you know, Michigan State University started this concept with Dr. Robert Drajanowicz, 1988, 1998, when he reigned there, on community policing. And this is like the antithesis of community policing, that I think. And it also sort of changed law enforcement operations. And we have to really look at that internally within law enforcement, saying, and again, it goes back to my opening remarks saying, you know, you're being told you have to use this, you know, use it or lose it on equipment. So we really need to look at how we've changed law enforcement operations and incorporated equipment that maybe we did need to incorporate. And even most important, I think, is that we really changed, and this is the one I'm going to defer back to Lou on, we really changed community perceptions of law enforcement. You know, it's not just a loss of trust, but it's a sort of a loss of legitimacy when it's taken to its extent, as we see with the recent loss of many of Black arrestees, or Breonna Taylor in a different circumstance. So I think those are a couple issues that need to be addressed.
If I could follow up on that, I agree with everything that General McDaniel just said. And if you take a step back from the community perspective and you look at it from the community's eyes, when they look at police forces this day, in today's age, a lot of times they see a very militarized police force. And going back even further than what General McDaniel referred to, is we really can track the militarization of police all the way back to the Nixon administration. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of writing on that when President Nixon was working on his war on drugs. That's really when militarization started. That's when using flashbang grenades and search warrants really took off. And what has happened in the same time as militarization of the police has become, the police as a profession has become professionalized. So they're better educated. Most police officers have a degree or academy training. A lot of police officers have law degrees. So as on the one track, we've got the militarization happening, and on the other track, we have professionalism increasing. And part of professionalism, any profession, is training, consistent, ongoing training. And so our officers are being indoctrinated, and I don't use that word in a demeaning way at all, but they're being trained to do their job in the context of a militarized operation. And so that's what the public sees. And so that it creates an inherent tension between the police and the community. So I think that's one of the talking points that will need to be addressed going forward is, does every single duty, does every single task a police officer performs have to be done in combat gear or in a militarized fashion or in hand-me-down government, army, military equipment? So that is a talking point that needs to be addressed going forward.
And as Tanya and Michael said, as it relates to the militarizing the police force, the more, and what the problem that occurred because of that, the more militarized the police became, that peacekeeping efforts and that peacekeeping role diminished. And Mike was talking about 1033, and it was, you know, when police agencies started receiving these militarized equipment and tanks and, as Tanya said, flashbangs and all these other things. I think between I think it was 1997 and 2014, there was over $5 billion worth of equipment that was shared to law enforcement agencies that militarized those organizations. And that's kind of frightening. I remember the first time I actually saw a tank rolling down the street. I was a young kid, and it was during the 67 riots in Detroit. And all I remember is I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And I immediately, being a really, really young man, ran in the house. I heard the individuals on the tanks ordering people to do certain things, but it was a very, very frightening look, even as a young child. So.
Absolutely. And then, you know, imagine how that fundamentally changes the relationship between the local police department and the community, right? If the community feels that way, the way that Lou just described, right? Seeing tanks coming into their neighborhoods, ordering them, you know, to do this and that. You know, I heard a criticism, you know, about police and community relationships but something like this. Well, you know, suspects often escalate these situations because they have this inherent, they assume that the police are the enemy. So they go into this, right, you know, thinking that something bad is going to happen. And it's this vicious cycle because inevitably then the police think that they're resisting and then something happens. If they would just comply, right? If they would just show respect, if they just wouldn't go in with this, you know, with this attitude. But not only, right, have they seen this incident play out over and over again in their communities, this particular incident, you know, the George Floyd incident, they've also seen, again, the gradual militarization of police and this shift away from this notion of serving and protecting, right? And this shift toward being this presence in community that is threatening, right? And it's hard, it's nuanced because the very people that they're, you know, that the police are supposed to be serving are viewed with suspicion by the residents, right? Because of a lot of the things that, you know, that they just talked about. And then, so it makes it hard for even parents to teach their kids, right, about how to view the police or what perspective to have about them, you know, how scared to be if you get pulled over, et cetera, because we've just come to this place where there's a dichotomy, you know, or a general acrimony between police and community. And it's not supposed to be that way, right? Police officers are supposed to provide a level of kind of security and protection to the community as a whole while trying to address, right, incidents as they come up, right? Not as the mortal enemy. So.
And being in former law enforcement, I know, and I think this way also, that there has to be some type of balance, you know, meaning that we can't get to a point where law enforcement officers are outgunned, I should say, by the small segment of society that wants to cause harm to people and individuals. So there has to be a balance there as far as what equipment police really need to protect themselves, to protect the general public. And when these incidents arise, that they have at least enough equipment to actually curtail and get the job done without totally tying the hands. So there's a balance there, and that's going to have to be worked out and discussed along the way as well.
Yeah, if I could give a shout out to Lewis P. Cooper and his comment about the 1033 program being not only developed to assist with the war on drugs, but to attack Black communities. There is at least one author that I know of that shares by writing and research that premise as well. And if you have not read, I would encourage you to read Radley Balco's Rise of the Warrior Cop. And he chronicles through history, documents, congressional hearings, that very premise. So I just wanted to make sure I shouted that out. And the other question is about the relationship of the uniform the police officer wears with the concept of militarization. And I think that's exactly what Lou and Tracy were just speaking to, that when law enforcement presents itself as an army or as a militarized force to the community, that sets the stage. And so the people in the community think, oh my gosh, this is an occupying force coming into our community to beat us down. But also, I think it shifts the conversation to another point, and it's the effect that it has on the psyche of law enforcement. What effect does being militarized have on the way police perceive the way they're going to do their job? And let me say, yes, I'm a former defense lawyer, but I have the utmost respect for police officers, always have. I respect that you're willing to put on the badge, carry the gun, and do the job that I don't have the courage to do. So it's not anti-police. And like you said, Christina, we can be pro both sides and have an intelligent conversation. But we have to be realistic about the effect this has on the psyche of law enforcement. If they're trained in a militarized fashion, if they're constantly fighting a war, think of the way you've been trained. Everything is a war. It's the war on drugs, it's the war on crime, it's the war on this. And you're using equipment that is militarized versus a good old-fashioned uniform. Eventually that takes a toll on how you view the community as well, and for some more than others, agreed. So I think it's a two-way conversation, not just the effect it has on the community, but the effect it has on the way the police view the community.
That's a great, great distinction that I think many people don't really understand. I guess I think of the Camden, New Jersey example of, you know, the police starting to rebuild their trust and legitimacy with the community by going around on Thanksgiving and giving families turkeys and being invited in and being a facilitator of that type of close relationship where there would be trust. And I think one of the concerns, and even as a, you know, a law and order watching individual, you worry about, you know, law enforcement in England, for example, do not carry weapons. And, you know, I've always thought, well, that's crazy, but it's a different approach to how you integrate with the community. And when they're not with a weapon, then it's a different feeling towards them and what good or bad they could do. So I think one of the concerns for many in the community, and I'm sure about with law enforcement, is whether or not that approach really works. You know, it's kind of in the unicorns and, oh, everything's great and we're all having tea. But when that drug dealer or that person literally shoots a law enforcement officer in the face when they go to give a ticket, everything changes. And so if you could just comment a bit on how you protect law enforcement while still being effective as a deterrent.
Yeah, let me jump in first, Christina. I think there's a strong analogy between law enforcement and the military, obviously, which I am just or more familiar with. You know, when we were in large bases in the desert prior to doing our counterinsurgency strategy, we weren't very effective. You know, we'd go out on patrols in full battle rattle, and we didn't have as much contact with the community itself. So it was only after General Madison, General Petraeus write the counterinsurgency manual. General Petraeus is in charge. We're surging more armed forces there so that we can actually address and get out in the communities and meet with the community leaders, civilian community leaders, if you will, that we started being effective and of course, killing bad guys, but having the community help us identify those bad guys. And I think that's where we were with law enforcement back in 1988 to 1998, when we were talking about community policing. It's the idea of building long-term relationships out in the community by having officers out in the community long-term. I remember it always strikes a chord with me, a law enforcement friend of Lou's and mine telling me about his grandfather, who was one of the first African-American officers in the city of Detroit with DPD prior to World War II. And he was, when all the white officers got vehicles, he didn't get a vehicle. And he said to his grandson, who said it to me, he said, "That's okay. I want to walk my community." And that's really the essence of community policing. It's the idea that you park and walk, you're doing foot patrols, but it's more than just walking the community. It's getting to know your community. And so we have to get back to that. And you have to balance that with officer safety, which, as Lou said, with high velocity weapons these days, I don't have a problem and we should be wearing as much protective gear as possible, but we don't need to anonymize the officer when we do so. One of the things that I was most disturbed about was seeing pictures of officers in Lafayette Square back on June 1st or whatever the date was, where there wasn't even any identifying markers on those officers at all. You couldn't tell if they were law enforcement or military. You couldn't tell if they were DC or if they were federal. that's not building any sort of connection with the community at all. The idea of anonymizing the officers is the exact opposite of community policing. We've got to find a better balance there.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. I think, Mike, you are right on point, because I think in order to achieve that balance and make sure that officers are protected and communities are served, you have got to have a foundation of trust and accountability. And so the community, right, has to be able to trust, right, the officers and vice versa, but also they have to know that when a Derek Chauvin does something like what happened, that the officer is going to be held accountable. And that, I think, happens when the community gets to know the officers and vice versa. When I was a kid growing up in Detroit, I was in that kind of magic kind of, 70s and 80s. My brother played for the PAL League Football Police Athletic League. They ran football leagues. They came and told us not to do drugs in our classrooms. And it doesn't mean that everything was all roses, but it did mean that we knew, right, the officers in our neighborhood, and our instinctive view of the officer was not as the enemy. I serve on a police chief advisory board here in Grand Rapids, and there's a young man on the board who's the head of our local youth NAACP chapter, and he's probably in his early 20s, and he was talking to our police chief, who's African American, was talking about inviting young people to come in and do internships at the police department, right, to help, again, make inroads in the community. And he said, I don't know if I can get, right, my folks to do it. They don't want to come into the police department. They don't trust coming into the police department. They can't see themselves, right, interning. Their whole view of police is one of acrimony. And so one of the things, they were talking about is getting back, in essence, to what Mike said, and having police officers in community. I also think that cuts down, because the other problem is, and again, I know that officers have a tough job in the sense that they are going to communities, not unlike, I would imagine, going into wartime situations in which the very community that you're policing, you have both victims and you have perpetrators, right? And it's hard to distinguish the two. And so there are some folks that you are combating, right? Like you're trying to find you're trying to find the bad folks without, having too much civilian casualties, so to speak. And so how do you achieve that? And I think one of the ways you do that is by not anonymizing the community, right? By getting to know the people in the community, so that you could tell my Black 14-year-old son from, maybe another kid in the neighborhood who's doing wrong, and you don't lump them all together. You know what I mean? And the way that you do that is by walking that beat, right? Is by getting to know, the folks that are there. And that's at least a start. Then you would have communities, who would hopefully be trusting enough to actually help police officers solve crimes, right? Help root out bad elements, as opposed to not wanting to have anything to do with them for fear that, their son is going to go the way of of Trayvon Martin or countless others. So.
And if I can piggyback off what Mike and Tracy said, I think it leads us toward this conversation of and I'm going to use the word compromise. Yes, I'm going to use that word. This point of compromise where we can all come to the table with all different perspectives of this and have a conversation. So our police need to be safe. They're keeping us safe. At the core of their job is to keep us safe. So we need to figure out how, as a community, we can make sure our police officers can do their job in a way that is effective and safe. Every chief of police wants every one of their officers to come back at the end of their shift. I mean, we want them to be safe. Our communities need to be safe as well. So one of the things that when you look at best practices for community policing, and there are several different models out there, but most of them agree that for any community policing model to be effective, law enforcement has to buy in to the fact that they have a role in the community. They need to get to know their community. Some of those models require the police officer to live in the community they serve. And that's a whole nother topic for conversation, but they have to invest in the community and get to know the community. And the beautiful thing that does is it allows the community to get to see the good side of law enforcement instead of the bad side of law enforcement. But it also gets our society back to a point of accountability. And while I know that is a whole nother topic for a whole nother day, communities have to realize that they're accountable for conduct too, that they have responsibility to the community. So when we look at effective models of community policing, it builds up trust on both sides, it builds up expectations on both sides, and it builds up accountability and responsibility. on both sides. So I think that's worth talking about.
We have some great questions. I did want to just comment that I think when you are looking at models like that, it changes it from being an us versus them to all of us versus crime. So the crime is what people really want to stop. The communities want to stop it as much as law enforcement does. But if it ends up being an us versus them, law enforcement versus the community, you can't move forward against crime, which is the mission. So that's our mantra at HS Today. It's all about the mission. So the mission is to stop our kids from getting addicted to drugs, to stop the drug dealers. You know, that's the mission. And then how we cooperate as a community and as law enforcement to make sure we can get there is another challenge. And they're economic. I mean, there's a lot wrapped into that, which, you know, defund the police and some of those efforts are talking about addressing. You know, a law enforcement officer is a social worker, a military person, a law enforcement, you know, psychologist, marriage therapist. They wear so many different hats, and it's a lot to ask of, as Colonel McDaniel said, of someone not being paid that well. You know, they're not paid to have 13 PhDs in different things, and so how we assist them to do their jobs, which they genuinely want to do well, is incumbent on all of us to discuss and actually move forward on. We have a great comment about, I think this was back when you were speaking, Mike, but Noel Miller was saying initial evaluation of police candidates is key. However, periodic regular psychological evaluation needs to be conducted on a police agency. Police officers' attitudes, biases, and prejudice can change, and often do, the longer they're on a department and the greater negative contact is that they have with individuals in the community. That's important to look for signs and changes in officer character, etc., and protests an agency against liabilities in officer retention, corrective actions, etc. So I think that's exactly what you were getting to.
Yes, I would comment, certainly agree with the second half. Well, I agree with the whole thing, but I will say on the first half, it's very difficult to do. There's a disincentive for law enforcement, just like there's a disincentive for members of the military to admit to any sort of psychological issues. We see it so many times with individuals with PTSD coming back from overseas. You want to stay with your group, you want to fight, and you've been given this warrior mentality. It's very difficult to get individuals to open up about that sort of thing. And that's why we end up looking for external triggers, because the self-reporting of internal triggers is very difficult for individuals to do.
Excellent. We have some great comments from Lewis Cooper Jr. And Lewis, I don't want you to stop. You're making great comments. He is obviously in the state of Washington, and he said he's pushing others that the training at the State Criminal Justice Training Academy needs to reformat the training that police officers receive. To all of the speakers' points, they're trained like they're going into a war zone, and that's how communities respond to them. So again, as Black communities, they're seen as the enemy. So there is no trust or communication. It becomes one-sided. And then he had one other item, and he says he'll stop, but I'm encouraging him not to. But it would be helpful in his mind that the history of policing be clearly articulated to all police being trained. They don't have an understanding of the history of the second phase of policing in this nation, that being slave patrols. So if you look at the history of this country and policing, particularly in the South, they allowed for slave patrols on horses with guns, whips, dogs, and clubs to capture free and runaway slaves. That history impacts the Black community, and they see that behavior demonstrated over and over again with the shooting of Black men. It could help bridge a bit of the gap with police and the history with Black communities. Excellent.
I think that's a phenomenal point. And that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about having real conversations about some of the dynamics at play and the history of race in the country, right? So he's absolutely right. This notion of law enforcement being a tool to control Black people, right, has been around since
the founding of our country, the use of slave patrols to retrieve those who dared run away, the use of officers even in the 50s and 60s to enforce Jim Crow laws, turning the other way, if not outright participating in lynchings, opening the jailhouse door in the middle of the night, to allow vigilante justice. And that's, those are the images that a lot of people who grew up during that time, that's the basis for some legitimate, suspicion. And so, of law enforcement, and again, maybe even some unintentional or implicit bias on behalf of officers in the way that they see Black communities. And so I think that that accounting for that in training is key. I think that diversity in law enforcement is key, right? Often you have communities being policed by people who don't live in the community, who don't look like the community, right? And who have a tortured history, right? With that community. And so I agree with Lewis. I think that is key, is understanding that dynamic.
And I'll make a quick comment, and full disclosure, and my life is full of conflicts in the sense that how do you go from being in the Michigan State Police for 25 years, and then your first legal job you get is to become a criminal defense attorney? So I kind of had some issues there, which were nice. There weren't any problems at all. But I think you kind of have to, I'm encouraging minority candidates to join police departments, because I think you could make a difference there, because we need to be on the inside. And as such, and like I said, I was there, and sure, I'm a criminal defense attorney, but my son, in full disclosure, my son has now been in the Michigan State Police as a trooper for the past year and a half. So I've got this dual role. I mean, I've locked up so many people in 25 years that I can never make up for getting them out on the defense side, but I really try hard. And it works a lot of times too. So it's very helpful, but we need to be in these law enforcement agencies. We need to join up. And I know that it's discouraging to minority communities as, how am I going to join this organization when you have your literally foot on my knee, on my neck? But you have to get past that, because down the line, it cannot continue. And one of the ways it can be resolved to some degree is to join these agencies. I made a decision a month ago that even though I'm out of law enforcement, but I still teach, criminal procedure related courses and criminal procedure, I'm going to start teaching at some of the police academies. I want to be back on the inside a little bit more. So this fall, I expect to be teaching at one of the local police academies. I want to be a part of all of this and do my part, whatever that is, to assist and help in any way I can.
Well, and you're talking about the crux of it. I mean, police training, that's a huge piece of it. Understanding the perspectives of different communities, especially with what we just discussed about the slave patrols, et cetera. That type of information is not only enlightening, it's shocking, and it's very educational. It really helps provide the perspective. So I see in our Q&A, we're having a debate over how a law enforcement officer is dressed when they have a lot of things hanging off their vests. And would you discuss a little bit more just how the perception of the appearance of uniforms in relationship to the concepts of militarization? So the exterior vest with a lot of gear hanging off of it, looking like they're going to combat. How does that impact the perception of a community?
So let me start off if I can. If you take an individual in full military uniform and you have some experience with the military, then you can read an individual's biography. You know who they are, you know how long they have served if they're enlisted, you know where they have served, you know the units they have been in, and you certainly know their name. So there is not just a sense of authority by the uniform, but there's a sense of identification as well. And by anonymizing our officers, and or making this sort of warrior model when you're in full Kevlar, face shields, et cetera, we're losing that identification. And I think to a degree, we're losing that authority that comes with it as well. The authority is based upon recognition. When we have individuals in uniform, as I said before, and you can't tell if they're federal or state, and you can't tell if they're military or law enforcement, then there's been this loss of some very important lines. And by important, I mean truly important, back to the constitutional era. You know, the 10th Amendment specifically reserved all rights to the states that weren't taken by the federal government when the states provided or acceded rights to the federal government. They did not accede the police powers to the federal government. So federal police powers are meant to be extremely limited to federal buildings, federal territory, and the borders, and certain interstate crimes, of course. So to have federal law enforcement, as we saw in Lafayette Square, without any of these signs of identification, they lack authority by doing that. Now, I'm certainly in favor of any form of safety gear that's necessary, but you can combine a uniform with safety gear at the same time. You know, if you look at the military, you're still going to have that individual being able to identify themselves. You're wearing your identification, your unit, and your name is going to be present over your battle rattle. You don't have to subject it underneath. And I think that we need to do that with law enforcement as well. As I said, that's personally a great concern to me, but I want to make sure everybody understands. It goes right back to that dual sovereignty of both states and federal entities under the Constitution. And I'm very concerned by this sort of perception lately of federalizing law enforcement. There was an article on Oregon Public Radio just yesterday about federal law enforcement patrolling downtown Portland and arresting individuals that were not connected with a federal building and were not connected with an immigration matter, which is a whole another issue for another discussion as to the extent that should have and how close to the border you need to be. But just the fact that they are doing that traditional state and local law enforcement function at all, should that story prove to be accurate, and I assume it is, suggests an increasing federalization of law enforcement in the local communities where you do not have that neither the transparency nor the close tie, and therefore the reporting to the local community. So it's not just local law enforcement. There's also an issue of federalizing as well. But in both cases, we've been seeing this loss of identity. And again, I submit my premise to you is that when there's a loss of identity, there's also a loss of authority for the law enforcement.
And if I can touch on that, that goes back to another constitutional rule that we recognize in every jurisdiction in this country, and that's when police officers are executing a search warrant, they have to knock and announce their authority. Again, the idea that they're there in uniform, they're there doing their job, and they have to let the people inside know that they have the authority to do what they're about to do. So this idea of being able to identify a police officer and recognize their authority is something that goes all the way back to common law and is embedded in our constitutional concepts. And to that point, if we look at the Breonna Taylor situation, I want to make a connection between the anonymous type militarized gear that Mike was talking about and where it comes into conflict with another point of law that can lead to the tragedy that we saw in the Breonna Taylor case. So with many police departments, when they execute search warrants, they are in some type of, I'm just going to call it battle gear for sake of conversation. When they come to a home to execute a search warrant and they're in battle gear and they have a face shield on so that you can't see who they are and you can't recognize who they are, and they further are doing a no-knock warrant at night, they may have been authorized to do by a magistrate that nighttime no-knock warrant. But here's where it conflicts with another rule of law. The people inside that house, if they cannot tell that that's police at the door in the middle of the night, they think that's intruder. Guess what? They now have the lawful right to defend themselves or their habitation with deadly force. And the whole point of the knock and announce rule in the first place was to protect officer safety and prevent the destruction of evidence. So what I would ask police departments to do, I get that there are sometimes they need to do no-knock warrants. I get that. I know that there are sometimes it may be necessary to do that at night if the jurisdiction allows for that. But I'd really ask the police departments to, along with what Mike is saying, take a long, hard look at why are your police officers dressed the way they are when they're performing a specific task, and ask yourself the hard question. Are you doing it to protect your police officer, protective gear? Or are you doing it for the element of surprise? And if you're doing it for the element of surprise, what are the unintended consequences? What happened in the Breonna Taylor case is a classic example of unintended consequences.
And to go along with that, Tanya, as well, and for the rest of the group, I've executed hundreds of search warrants over my years in law enforcement. And you make a good point about how do they know who we are? Knocking for 5, 6, 7 seconds and then entering if the door is not open. I can't ever remember going and executing a raid where I did not have uniformed patrol cars outside at the exact same time with the lights and overheads on as the undercover officers were executing the search warrant at the door. So if they were to look out the window, they would see police cars flashing lights outside their home in their driveway. And even though you may not see a uniform officer coming through the door as the first person, you do at least recognize that they are law enforcement officers. That's not done everywhere.
Correct.
I would even say, as you probably understand, I know you do, that it's not done in most places. But when something bad happens, and you get called in, it's like, what was your plan? What was your raid plan? What did you do? Who did what? And how was it organized? And I had to answer those questions. So I made sure that everything was in order. And General McDaniel mentioned it earlier, because if they weren't in order, someone's going to have some problems if things go bad. They're going to look at the raid plan, as if you will, how things were organized and controlled, who had this job, that job, and who was there. So those are important factors. I thank for bringing those up, because they are important key issues.
If I might interject, you are all talking about legitimacy, and you're talking about the ability for a citizen to identify law enforcement, and those are critical pieces to us, understanding what's actually happening. Recently, and probably not as recently as we've known about it, we have learned that there are external actors working to use disinformation to encourage people to dislike one another even more, and using things like Back the Blue campaign on Facebook that was actually initiated by the Russians, and then concomitant activity for Black Lives Matter, and that things are being exacerbated by external forces, and they're playing on our lack of trust, and our loss of legitimacy in many communities. How do you all, this is, a question of this era of Facebook and just the ability of gossip and untruths to fly around the internet so fast that, we wake up in the morning and there's just new craziness every day. How do we help our citizens and our law enforcement parse through that and stay focused that Americans and Americans together can do great things, can be a community, can work together and care about one another when we have so many things working to tear us apart? Our own biases, in addition to external forces, literally trying to destroy us.
I honestly think police leadership is doing a great job at answering that question. One of the things that we've seen police officers around the country, police chiefs in particular, around the country step up and do is open the lines of communication. And if there's an open line of communication, again, to the extent possible, I understand that the police can't tell the community everything, right? That would undercut investigations and prosecutions, et cetera. We get that. But to the extent that you can have an open line of communication with the public and it's sincere and authentic, then that's going to help undercut any false narrative that's being put into the internet universe. And I mean, locally in Grand Rapids and Lansing, I can't speak to Auburn Hills, Lou, but we are seeing the police coming out and being very open about wanting to have community conversations, and so that everybody's operating with the same set of facts. And I think that shows a great sense of leadership from law enforcement, and I think it's a great first step.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. And I think that we have to continue to try to cut through this cognitive dissonance that we have all fallen victim to, where we seek to enforce what we want to believe, right? We seek to, enforce stereotypes or political views or whatever it is that we want to believe. And so we often don't even want to hear. Not only do we not want to hear what others have to say, we tend to be lured in, right, by this false information that's being disseminated because maybe it fits into our worldview. And so I think, communication and transparency from law enforcement, and continuing to try to find, right, premises around which we can all agree, right, and kind of resetting the starting point. Instead of it being police against Black Lives Matter, right, let's start, right, by agreeing, as Tanya said earlier, that communities want to be safe and officers need to be protected, right? Can we kind of reset and then talk from there? Let that be the springboard for our discussions, as opposed to, these incendiary posts that we see, that online and in other places. But
And let me give you a good example of that. And this predates George Floyd by a couple of years, several years, as a matter of fact. But Tracy and I had the opportunity when the Grand Rapids Police Department was debating whether or not to have officers wear body cameras. They invested into the community. They reached out to community organizations and legal experts. And Dean Brame and I actually were asked to give an advisory opinion on the pros and cons of wearing the body cameras, and if they adopted a body camera policy, what we would want to see in that particular policy to ensure, to the extent possible, that individuals' rights were protected, as well as police officers' rights of privacy were protected. And that went a long way. And I think the Grand Rapids Police Department ended up with a pretty darn good body cam policy as a result of that. So again, when law enforcement's communicating with the public, it can lead to some really good results.
We have another question from Joe Ray. Walk into any racially mixed high school and you will see Black, white, and Latino youth clustered in their own groups. Is this self-segregation a problem to address or a coping strategy? People want to surround themselves with others with similar backgrounds and experiences. I agree with Lewis. What steps should individual police departments take to break down barriers and create an inviting environment for African-American police candidates?
I think that as police officers and police departments, and I've seen this, they are reaching out to minority candidates even more than they have been over the past few years. But it's still a challenge, and I say that is because you have to make sure that, because minority candidates the vast majority are not going to come to the police agency. The police agency needs to go out and meet the community where they're located. And if you have recruiting efforts in that regard, it's going to be very, very helpful, because there's a lot of distrust in the community, and it's even worse now for obvious reasons. And you have to get to a point where I remember when I joined, not that any of my friends were doing anything wrong. I want to say that first. But you have to be willing to separate yourself. There wasn't the internet, GPS at the time. So when I got assigned to my first post, I never even heard of the town. I didn't care where the town was located. I knew it was in the state of Michigan. That's all I knew. I grabbed a map and I said, if I take this freeway, I can get to my first state police assignment, because I just wanted to be a part of the organization. But in this day and age, you really have to, law enforcement agencies really have to reach out to those communities and make them feel welcome. And they are not going to feel welcome if you don't reach out to them first.
I think it involves criminal justice programs at all of the universities as well, whether the officers, the would-be, soon-to-be officers are seeking an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. I think the schools that offer criminal justice programs need to do a better job of recruiting at that end as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, to answer the question, at least from my perspective, I think that first question of, people wanting to kind of sit together and things like that, is it self-segregation or is it a coping mechanism? That question's been around since I know I would get that question a lot in college, and that was a long time ago. And I would say it's probably a little bit of both, right? So, not self-segregation in the sense of not wanting to be around others, but um, in the sense of wanting to spend time with people with shared experience, right? Particularly if you're, intimidated for whatever reason by the circumstances around you. When I went to college, I grew up in inner city Detroit, and I had not been in classrooms and other, situations with large numbers of other people. And it was comforting to me, right, to know that I wasn't the only one in that situation, and that, I could, I could sit and vent or unload or whatever, with people who were from Detroit or with other African American students. I also, right, though, took opportunities to strike up relationships with other people. And I think that we have to be able to do that. I don't think there's, anything wrong with me having a glass of wine with Tanya to talk about, what it's like to be a woman in the legal profession these days, right? But while also obviously, being friends with and appreciating with and have a relationship with Mike and with Lou. And so, again, I think that goes, kind of to an understanding that we have or that we try to gain with each other, that I don't think that people of color are pushing others away, right, when they convene. And I think anything that we can do to invite people to come together, while also understanding the need for community, would go a long way.
Absolutely. So we had a question that was submitted pre-webinar, and that is, what is some of the low-hanging fruit, or what are some of the things that law enforcement departments could do to encourage the momentum and just keep positive momentum going in the direction of reform?
So let me start off and talk generally, and then we can get some specifics. I think one of the, defund the police always seems like the wrong verb to me. And I think that it makes many policymakers sort of defensive as a result. But one of the things that we have to do is let law enforcement be law enforcement. And I don't mean that there should not be oversight at all. What I do mean is that we should allow law enforcement to do their core functions. So if we need to have a debate about how funds are being expended, there is not an excess or overabundance of funding going to law enforcement these days. You can certainly say it's going to the wrong places. So as I said earlier, salaries. I said, secondly, we've got to look at training. If it's certain weapon systems that are coming with the 1033 program, the Defense Logistics Agency put certain controls in place, but it didn't require training in some of those weapon systems and other equipment that's somewhat sophisticated that was being provided free of charge except for shipping to local law enforcement. But the need for training goes to the community itself. I remember, I'm looking at Lou, 20 years ago or so, the Michigan State Police did training, agency-wide training on what was called verbal judo, the idea of de-escalating circumstances through communication. And that's the sort of training that we need. And then the other one, going to the idea of let them be law enforcement, it's the idea of we've got to get them out of the social worker mentality. They're not good at it. Some of them are great at it, and and they can be, and they have a function. But you need to be using some of those dollars to have separate trained social workers working directly with law enforcement, rather than expecting the law enforcement to do that as well. It's just too much to do. They need to be focused on their core functions. But one of those core functions, as I said before, is community policing.
Did anyone have any other comments on kind of low-hanging fruit that we could take care of today that would build that momentum? And perhaps just as an extension of that question, reassure the public that we're not going to defund the police. I think you're absolutely right. Police serves an absolutely critical function, even if we hate it when you see them walking up to your car to give you a ticket. There is a critical portion, a critical role that they play in our society, and there's so many that do support that and understand that when you break the law, there do need to be consequences. Otherwise, we can really end up in a bad place. But instilling more of that cooperative approach to solving crime rather than an us versus them, I think are there any other suggestions from the panelists of how we can encourage law enforcement chiefs or departments to implement in the near term?
Well, I can tell you here in Grand Rapids, like I said earlier, our police chief, Eric Payne, he relatively recently started a police advisory board through which he has invited members of the community, right, to come in and express their concerns. And he's trying to be as transparent as possible. Like, so we sit down every other week, right, and truly talk about the direction in which the police department is going, how they're allocating their budget, et cetera. And he's tried to curate the board to be representative of different facets of the community. So like I said, there's a young African-American man who's in his 20s. You know, there are those of us who've been around for a while. There are white people, there are Black people, et cetera. And he's not just looking for yes people that agree with him or people to defend the police. He really wants to hear from critics as well. And what I think he's hoping to do is, right, through that transparency, is to give us and the community a little bit better sense of who he is, what the department is trying to achieve, and what they're already doing. And then perhaps have some allies, right, when people are shouting for defunding the police, right, have some people in the room that have had these conversations and say, hey, I understand your frustration, but right, let's look at what the department is really doing and how we might, better allocate resources, et cetera. So lines of communication, inviting members of community in, increasing efforts to recruit, officers from varying backgrounds and locales, things like that, I think can be done in the near term.
And the issues of transparency, I know Mike just talked about some of that as it relates to defunding the police. What exactly are we talking about? So he kind of covered that. But then we also have other proposals that are out there, like auditing police agencies for every time an officer is involved or engaged in some type of use of force action, and making sure that the records are kept of that. And I would say records of when use of force was warranted, as well as records of use of force when it wasn't warranted, and make sure that there's someone that's actually not only doing this, but someone actually auditing the process and making sure that it's looked at every 6 months, or to see if there's a pattern that's taking place. And if there is some kind of pattern, then it can be addressed early on before something else happens, because as we know, the end result of not doing anything and keeping stats and records and actually not doing anything with them once you get them, it leads to possible violations of constitutional rights of citizens, and you end up with the police department being sued. So it benefits everyone. It saves lives. It saves law enforcement agencies from having to pay out large damage awards from lawsuits. And it's just a matter of tracking what your officers are doing in the police agencies and keeping up with this. And I'm not talking about releasing everything to the public. I mean, people resist arrest at times, and it's not about giving the public every time there's some type of an arrest being made where there's the person's resisting or not, that the public has access to everything. But they should have access to some things that are reasonable after the case itself has been resolved, so that they understand how police are dealing with the public at large. I think those issues of transparency will go a long way in the community.
Well, that may be one good place for social media to come in. We do, as HS Today, we collect a lot of different feeds from the United States, but we also we've subscribed to the Metropolitan Police from London. and they have a very active Twitter feed and email feed that lets the public know about kind of everything going on. So even if, I mean, I get everything from a terrorist being arrested to an accident at the corner to whatever happens, but they're very transparent in their communications, even to the point where they will announce that cases have been brought against an officer, and then they report what happened with that case. And so it's an interesting march of information that covers pretty much everything going on with them. So, I mean, I guess we'd have to talk to people in London to see if they really believe that they're really telling us everything. But it seems like a very good use of social media and trying to inform the public of what's happening. So I will pivot for a moment because we do have an interesting question, I think, from an international participant. And the question is that police corruption and lack of operational and institutional accountability have been the bane of policing in developing countries, especially those with emerging democracies. What existing international partnerships can relevant NGOs leverage on to inspire a vibrant judiciary and better hold police in these countries accountable? Any ideas on that? I figured you, all of you who are lawyers, would be able to answer that.
That's a big question.
I'll start. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll start by just saying this. I just have one comment, and I'll let others speak. But when you talk about police corruption, it may not necessarily be. Well, I shouldn't say that. It would be considered a type of police corruption. I just noticed recently, within the last few days, where one of the local prosecutors here in Michigan has released a list of police officers that actually lie and have lied and have corrupted the system when they take the witness stand. And this particular county and this particular prosecutor has provided a list and basically has said, you cannot testify in any courts in this particular county. You can't testify. So the police chief is saying, well, what am I going to do with these officers? Some have quit, some have resigned, some have been fired, and then others that still remain on the police force because of this corruptive attitude of lying on the witness stand have been moved to other jobs within the police department where they're no longer able to interact with citizens, where the possibility that they would be needed to testify in court about evidence collection and any other contacts they have with the public. So I had never heard of that before until recently, that a prosecutor has actually done that here in the state of Michigan. So if nothing else, it's a start to a problem that goes to the question that was asked about police corruption and what can be done.
I think the accountability, both to the profession of being a police officer and to the community, calls for accountability and transparency. One of the things, and this I know can get into a whole different discussion about the effect of the police unions and whether the unions can impede or help implement progress, and that's a whole different conversation. But notwithstanding that, when you look at professions, the legal profession, the medical profession, for example, built into those professions is accountability, right? There's a review process, and I know police officers have internal affairs that they have to deal with, of course, but within the legal and medical professions, if there is wrongdoing, we as the profession view it as our duty to the public to let the public know that there's been a problem with this individual, and licensure can be affected, for example. And that's all about transparency. And if a lawyer messes up and gets reprimanded or disbarred, that's public information. And so while police continue to become better trained, better educated, some are lawyers, and for all accounts are being trained, treated, and acting like professionals, then that transparency and accountability becomes a really important piece that can help to minimize, maybe not entirely eliminate, but to minimize graft and corruption.
Absolutely, and that expectation, I think, may liberate, the hopefully majority of officers who are not corrupt, right, to speak up and intervene when necessary, right, so that they're not standing around watching something horrible happen and feeling as though that they're more afraid of, right, their own police department than they are, you know what I mean, of the repercussions of the tragedy that they're watching. And so, you know, I think that not only holding bad actors accountable, but liberating those around him or her, and even requiring them to do the right thing.
Also, there's some of the police reform comments that are now being in Michigan here. One of them has to do with, as you just stated, a requirement to intervene. As you said about police officers just standing around watching other officers do things that are not proper, that are maybe even illegal, and not based upon policy, that you can no longer stand by. It doesn't make any difference whether or not the other officer is a sergeant and you're not. If you're a patrolman and the other officer is a sergeant and the sergeant is doing something wrong on the street of violating someone's constitutional rights, you have just as much police authority as your sergeant. You cannot stand by and allow your sergeant to do something that's a violation of someone's constitutional rights, because if you do, under all the proposed legislation that's coming out, you will find yourself in the same boat as that sergeant that you felt you couldn't do anything because you only had 2 years on the job and they had 15. You have to do something.
Thank you. Thank you for that discussion. We did have a question that I think, Mike, you kind of sneakily answered there in the Q&A, but it was such a good question that I did want everyone to be able to have a shot at discussing it a little bit. And that is that whenever the 911 is called, or whenever the police are called, or fire, or whoever, law enforcement is often the one to go in first, regardless. You're not going to send a social worker in first. You're not going to send the fire in first. Law enforcement has to be that front shield. And the question was, how do we get them out of that psychologist / sociologist role like we're discussing right now?
Yeah, thanks. I'll go first and then defer to Lou. As I was saying in my response to the question from Stephen Hagberg from Washington, we can't get law enforcement entirely out of the role. And in most forward-thinking jurisdictions, that there is fire EMS that are responding in some domestic encounters, as well as law enforcement, because they at least have some minimally greater training in an area. And there's also the possibility of, in many domestic encounters, for injury or violence. So law enforcement is always going to be needed there to protect the scene. But if we can get to the point where we can train social workers to either be co-responders or immediately thereafter, it would really, really help the circumstance. That's a huge step forward, but it's not a good role for law enforcement to do anything more than assure the security or the safety of all individuals that are present, whether it's just the two individuals that are engaged, or more individuals that are engaged and law enforcement, or if there are others present as well.
I agree with that. But understand, police officers arriving, they get a call, report to whatever, 22 Elm Street. They have no idea the mental state or condition of people under most circumstances until they arrive. And even then, they're concerned with making sure that innocent people aren't hurt by whatever dangerous activity is taking place. So law enforcement officers over 90% of the time have no idea the mental state of an individual unless they had numerous runs to that particular location in the past, because they have no idea. So they would still have to arrive at the scene first. And then if any contact is going to be made for someone else to assist in a social worker or mental capacity to assist them, that call would still need to go out after the arrival on the scene. And under most circumstances, things are resolved by the time someone else would arrive on the scene an hour later. So it is a difficult situation and a difficult task to undertake.
So we have about 7 minutes left. So I thought I'd leave the easiest question for all of you for last, which is, what is the path forward? You got 7 minutes.
You going first, Lou?
No, I think you should.
You know, my colleagues can attest to this. My leadership style is relational. I believe in relationships and good communication. I think the path forward must start with all vested parties sitting down at the table and having a discussion about, as we've already talked about, that police need to be able to do their job, keep the community safe, keep themselves safe, but we need to have a better buy-in from the community of responsibility for the community, and they need to be able to feel safe that the police aren't going to treat them like enemy combatants. So I think open communication, talking about what we agree on, and then working out from there. I am a strong proponent of increasing the community policing aspect of every department, whether it's a full-blown, full-scale community policing model, whether it's a hybrid, or whether you just adopt some techniques here and there and integrate it into your current policy. But community policing at its core, it has the police investing in the community and being accountable, and it has the community investing in the community and being accountable. And to me, that is a winning combination. So if we can get everybody to the table and start talking about that, that's the place to start.
I think that at every opportunity that police have when they're out on patrol, when they can get out of their patrol cars and actually talk to people about nothing, because when you see I mean, how many times have you seen the police pull someone over on the side of the road and actually said to yourself, I wonder what they didn't do wrong? So we need to get to a point where police can approach you and say hi to you and speak to you and engage you in a street game of catching the baseball or whatever it happens to be, so that every single time you see the police is not, you aren't thinking that something is wrong and here they are again, who's going to jail, who's going to get hurt or even seriously hurt. So we have to change that dynamic. And when police can get out of their patrol cars at every single opportunity, just to say hi to anybody they see out there walking down the street. All right, is everything okay? How you been? How's school going, young man? Okay, good to hear that. Stay on the right track. I'll see you later. Have a good day, and leave. It doesn't take a lot. It just takes a little, because it can change your perceptions of police officers greatly.
So I think most suggestions have been taken, but to reiterate what I said before, totally believe in more funding is necessary. More funding is necessary for training. Third, we didn't talk as much about it, but the idea of community oversight is key. I'm totally in favor of citizen oversight groups, but they have to truly understand law enforcement functions and can't go in there with too great of an advocacy role, so much as they're looking at what's best for the overall community. And that goes directly to what Lou was saying about records on the use of force being available and transparent. Doesn't have to be to everybody, but you can designate individuals to whom that they would be involved in every community. And then getting to the idea that Lou just mentioned about community policing, one of our it was Kelly Martin mentioned about the idea of school resource officers. It's a form of community policing that is still robust these days. You know, communities have to invest in SROs and school resource officers for both sides of the equation. They help law enforcement and they help the kids in the community. It doesn't matter if it's urban, suburban, or rural. SROs all have a function. They know their community. They know the kids growing up. It is like being in the neighborhood. They're talking to these young guys while they're still impressionable. You can steer them. You can recruit the right ones towards law enforcement. You can build relationships with others. You can have a sense of how you talk for the kids who become members of the community, that you can talk to law enforcement and have a communication with them. So I just wanted to emphasize that point because we strayed a little bit from it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say, echo what everybody else said, and whatever we could do to humanize one another to each other, right? Whatever we could do to build relationships and understanding, and temper our instinct toward knee-jerk reactions.
That is the best point to end on. I do have to say that they're trying to pull law enforcement out of the schools, though, and so that will be our next webinar that we get to talk about that. Thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon to tackle this tough topic. We've gotten some kudos just over here in the chat box. I want to thank all of you for taking the time, all of you for making the effort to work on this issue and share your thoughts. You've been amazing today. Our next webinar at HSToday on July 21st will continue with this series on law enforcement, but it will be a focus on state and local law enforcement. We are very honored to have Vince Patton, who's the former Master Chief Petty Officer of the U.S. Coast Guard, and also a Colonel Thomas Tuggle, who is a former Marine, who also runs training academies in the South to train law enforcement. That will be another discussion by some pretty inspirational leaders of how we can do just what Associate Dean Bream said, and that is to humanize one another, build understanding, and build bridges at a time where that seems to be very difficult to do. So thank you all for working on this topic. If there's anything you ever need from HSToday, we stand behind you and support you. Shoot me an email, text me, email me. I'm pretty much awake now under COVID 24/7. So I look forward to continuing working with all of you, and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.